From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 43. Olwyn Brightrock had just turned to call for the Arcane Lord, when the dark figure's hands suddenly flared into swirling balls of purple light. The hellish face of Saurzon Brimblade was illuminated for just an instant, before he posed his body in two quick movements. His hands chopped forward, sending the wicked, crackling orbs of energy out in quick succession. They found their targets with grim accuracy. The closer partisan who had initially called the warning was struck in the middle of his chest and went tumbling backward, propelled by the exploding magical ball. He tumbled and landed, crisp and smoking on the stones. The second elf had just enough time to wheel his horse around before the ball struck his mount. The resulting blast took the mount's head off in a flare of light. Horse and rider hit the stones on top of one another. The partisan was not killed immediately, but lay pinned and bleeding badly from the fragments of the horse skull shrapnel that dotted his chest and head. He let out an anguished cry which turned to a wet gurgle.
"Felix, we're under attack,"
the arch-partisan shouted, but the wizard was already thundering past on his steed, leaving the caustic wisps of vapour from his own spell in the air. The Arcane Lord sent forth a heavy blast of power that seared and crackled off the shield spell that Brimblade managed to raise just in time. The Arcane Lord launched skyward from the horse's back and landed down powerfully on the street, his force leaving a small impact crater of cracked stones. Felix's fingers curled and began to glow. Whereas he looked bored, casting an anti-magic charm on the endless vapid guests of the gala, the wide smile on the wizard's face said this was something he'd been waiting for his entire life. A true test of his skill. Fraenk was not one to freeze up in the heat of action, but there was no way he could help in a wizard battle. All he could do was rein up his stamping, panicky horse. And now, with two guards down, he couldn't help but think they were woefully unprepared and undermanned for this guard detail.
"Fraenk, get out of here!"
Brightrock shouted at him as another scream rose in the night air. This time it was from behind them. Fraenk had just twisted in his saddle as a riderless horse came barreling out of the darkness. It checked Frank's mount with its body, sending them pitching sideways. He nearly caught himself, but a surge of raw animal fear flooded his mind as the mind thief caught the fleeing beast's thoughts. He was weightless for a moment, then something hit him hard in the shoulder. Fraenk opened his eyes and saw he was on the ground. He scrambled to his feet, grasping for his own horse's reins, but it too turned and disappeared after the other in a clatter of hooves. Then more sounds came from the street behind them, shouted curses and clang of metal in the darkness. The mounted partisan was circling a figure on the ground, jabbing at him with his spear. But the dark assailant was armoured and swinging a massive two-handed sword. Although he was slower and lacked the height advantage of the mounted elf, there was something inexorable and dangerous about the way this man moved. He was military trained and he knew combat. He could sense when to avoid the darting spear and when to let it clang ineffectually off his armour. And when the armoured man countered, swinging the massive blade, the partisan elf could only wheel the horse back out of reach. "He cannot keep this up. That dark warrior is too strong," Fraenk thought, worried for the guard, and as if his thoughts could manifest the reality, Fraenk watched helplessly, in horror as his premonition came true. The mounted partisan rode forward, attempting an overhand jab, aiming for the open seam at the armoured man's neck, but the warrior ignored it entirely, countering with his own powerful angular cut. The tall blade came down, splitting the spear arm and body in one ugly blow. The partisan grunted heavily, then cascaded to the stones with a thumping sound of falling wet meat. The dark warrior hefted the dripping sword to his shoulder, turned, and stalked towards Fraenk and Brightrock. There were sounds of cracking energy and flares of light behind him, as Brimblade and the Arcane Lord spelled and countered each other, but Fraenk couldn't take his eyes away from the approaching nightmare. Beside him he heard Olwyn Brightrock slip from his saddle to the street and move up beside him. He pulled a beautifully ornate pair of twin swords from the sheath on his back. They were thin with delicate curved line work in the elven tradition. The metal was silvery, pale, and looked impossibly sharp. Fraenk had never seen a weapon so beautiful, let alone a matched set. Fraenk didn't know how well he'd do in another sword fight, especially with this monster. But perhaps if they worked together, they'd have a chance. Right, so I'll go from one side and you... Fraenk reached out to take one blade from him. Brightrock immediately pulled it back with a look of indignance.
I don't think so. I've seen your swordplay.
Brightrock snapped.
You take my horse and get to the registry. Summon the other arcane lords and then rally the partisans.
Fraenk tried to protest, but Brightrock maintained his aura of being very difficult to argue with. The old elf didn't wait for Fraenk's reply. With a sword in each hand, he charged forth toward the dark warrior. For being over 500 years old, the arch-partisan was shockingly agile. He attacked using a fighting form that Fraenk had never seen before, both swords moving in tandem, sometimes synchronized, and other times coming at opposing staccato, leaving bright hatches all over the man's heavy armor. The large combatant seemed downright sluggish in comparison, taking wild, sweeping chops at the old elf, who effortlessly sidestepped and danced in for another salvo of attacks.
Go on, Neversleep. Get out of here.
Brightrock grunted, jumping clear of another powerful stroke. There was something about the way the old elf was sweating that Fraenk didn't like. He also noticed how the elven blades were just as ineffectual as the other partisan's spear had been. Fraenk wasn't about to abandon Brightrock now. Somehow he had to help. Fraenk needed a weapon. Even a metal rod or discarded board would do. If he could distract the large man, maybe Brightrock could get behind him and land a blow on a more vulnerable part. But as Fraenk cast about for anything to use, he could only see how pristine the streets around him were kept by the legions of elven servants in the upper city. Even the white apple trees that lined the road were swept clear of any fallen fruit. The bodies of the fallen partisans were a short distance away, and both had weapons, spears like the other who had died, and the iron-knobbed clubs that the partisans were notorious for. But to get them would put Fraenk in way too close for comfort to the raging wizard battle that was now devolving into aimlessly fired bolts of electricity as the two magic users wore each other down. He felt something slip inside his glove. Fraenk almost cursed his own stupidity. In all the excitement, he forgot about the incredibly powerful weapon that had just been used against him. The Mind Thief. Closing his fist around it, Fraenk stepped forward and focused its power on the big man-at-arms. A crystalline crust of frost immediately formed on the glove.
Neversleep, what are you doing?
Olwyn Brightrock shouted. There was a cut along his left arm that was bleeding dark black in the moonlight. Give me a moment and I can stop him. Fraenk strained, raising his open hand toward the fighter. He focused his mind on pulling energy from the necklace and felt a surge move through him. An intoxicating buzz hit his brain, making it feel alive, and like he wanted to talk to everyone in the city, all at the same time. Or maybe make someone's eyes bleed and head explode. Stop. Focus, Fraenk told himself. He searched out with his mind for the dark warrior, who continued to swing the massive sword and never seemed to tire. But instead of where he would find all the memories, thoughts, and intentions, there was nothing. In fact, there was a complete absence of all of it. There was a void instead of a consciousness. Fraenk drew more power from the Mind Thief, probed deeper, searching every dark corner of the man. But there was no mind to grasp. His head was a pit, a void of darkness. "That's not possible," Fraenk whispered.
Did it work?
Brightrock called as he dodged another vicious swing. "No, I don't understand it," Fraenk shouted back, moving closer and pulling deeper from the necklace to no avail.
I can see that, you fool. That was sarcasm.
Olwyn replied, ducking under another cut. The Hell Touched had used magic to summon creatures from the Underrealm before. Perhaps this man was drawn from the other side as well. Some kind of infernal warrior, hollow of mind and soul. But Brightrock ducked under a flat cut and this time aiming a flurry of attacks at the warrior's legs. A small spray of blood spilled out from a cut at the dark figure's knee joint. If it could bleed, then it could die. "Maybe the helmet is blocking me," Fraenk said. "It could be enchanted."
Well, kindly ask him to remove it.
"You're being sarcastic again." Fraenk heard an agonized groan behind him and glanced back without thinking. The first partisan who had been hit by the energy ball was moving slightly. Somehow he was still alive. Fraenk could only imagine the pain he was experiencing. Beside the man's outstretched hand lay his spear. He needed that weapon, but there was no way he could run over, grab it, and get back in time to save his friend. Then a terrible idea came to him, and Fraenk nearly refused to consider it. But the dark warrior landed a vicious kick to Brightrock, sending him sprawling backward onto the street. The old elf was slow recovering and could only manage to crawl on his hands and knees. Fraenk had no time to think of the ramifications. He forced his way into the injured partisan's mind and immediately regretted it. He felt a full body wave of searing fire, like all his nerves were being ripped out of his skin. His teeth clacked together and a scream surged through him. The sensation was like nothing he had ever experienced before. All he could think was for some way to make it stop. The agony, the suffering. Make it stop. And then the pain turned to smoke. A cool feeling of relief almost brought him to tears. The partisan must have also been experiencing the same thing, for he relaxed as well. The necklace could somehow keep the elf from feeling his pain, which was a powerful mercy. Fraenk could feel the elf's mind clear, and he was filled with an overwhelming gratitude.
"Am I going to die?"
The elf asked calmly, more a question of fact than fear. "I need your spear." Fraenk sent his thoughts to the partisan, whose name he suddenly knew as Draver. The elf was confused in his thoughts, however, somehow not understanding why he was on the ground and unable to stand. Fraenk pressed again, more insistently. He knew with each moment that the malevolent warrior was advancing on Brightrock. "Draver, throw it to me!" Fraenk demanded from the partisan.
"Burn a prayer for me in the Temple of Brand, that I may comprehend the knowledge of what is beyond,"
Draver said. "Please, Draver, the spear. Your arch-partisan needs you." The elf moved mechanically, disassociated from his own body. His badly singed hand could barely grasp the weapon, with several fingers missing. Anyone else would have been experiencing agonizing pain, but the elf seemed more irritated by his body's difficulties in getting the spear to Fraenk. But soon he managed to haul back and toss the spear over. Yet again Fraenk found a weapon had come clattering to his feet. He was ready this time and hooked the toe of his boot underneath, flipping the haft up into his grip. Fraenk charged forward, drawing the spear back in two hands. The dark warrior was striding in toward Brightrock, who scrambled away trying to avoid the next overhand chop. Just as the man raised the blade, something hit him hard in the side of the head, sending his helmet flying and staggering him 2 paces to the side. A dark tangle of sweaty hair fell down over the man's face, and he shook his head, letting out a low moan. Then he let the big sword point fall, and with one hand he began to grasp furiously at the side of his head. He was moaning and turning like there was a fire in his brain, and he had no way to put it out. This was his chance, Fraenk realized. He quickly set the butt of the spear shaft on the ground and reached out again with the mind thief. He summoned its power more than he had ever before. Gritting his teeth, Fraenk sent his will forth with more power than he had ever attempted. He would stop this fiend right here and now. Then an odd thing happened. Reaching out for the warrior's head, Fraenk felt not one mind, but thousands, dark and primal and hungry. They were inhuman, and seemed to immediately sense Frank's mind touching them. And the moment they did, they surged towards him, latching on with mouths like leeches. There was a strong gnawing sensation at the edges of his sanity, like his own thoughts and memories, and any possibility that the world could be a right place ever again were being eaten. Then Fraenk heard himself laughing, mirthless and loud, jarring to his ears. He wanted nothing more than for the sound to quit. It was starting to drive him mad. But it was funny, wasn't it? Not funny, but terrible and joyous. And they all were so hungry. He couldn't stop. Fraenk had to feed them. He must feed them.
Neversleep, get a hold of yourself.
Olwyn Brightrock's voice was distant, but forceful. Fraenk knew it was the only way out of the black pit of sorrow his mind was quickly becoming. He forced his will toward the sound. It was everything he could do to pull back from the man's void of a head, where the chorus of hungry dark creatures fed. Fraenk tilted and fell sideways to the street. The dark warrior stopped his advance on Brightrock, seeming to sense Frank's incursion into his mind. Slowly he turned, the point of his blade dragging along the cobblestones and making a sanity-fraying scree with the edge. Fraenk was expecting to see a swirling cloud of nothingness in place of where the man's head was. Instead, he noticed something far more disturbing. The front of the man's armor was battered and war-tested, but now that he was closer, Fraenk could recognize a familiar design painted on the metal. It was the sigil of a major house of Arathis. And not just any house. It was the sigil of Blackroot. Why was this inhuman creature wearing the armor of the Blackroots? Fraenk looked up into the face of the dark warrior and cried out in anguish. He knew this man. Leos Muninger had been his friend, and now something was terribly wrong with him, because when he smiled, hundreds of tiny black worms fell out of his mouth. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.